Welcome, everyone. I'm Scott Myers. I'm an assistant professor in the film program at DePaul University, and I'm totally stoked to have as our guests today for this panel two talented writers who have carved out a career in Hollywood in the film and TV business. We have Brian Millikin, whose writing and producing credits include Haven, Shadowhunters, and Tell Me a Story, and Liz Hanna, whose writing credits include The Post, Long Shot, and the TV series Mindhunter. And the topic for today's conversation is writing movies, writing TV, and writing partners. And so we can cover a lot of territory because both of these folks have written across platforms. And I'd like to also maybe get into a little bit of an Oprah moment with y'all. How you survive as writers, both individually and collectively as a married couple. Okay, all right. So we'll save that sort of for the end of the thing.
I thought I was about to get a car. That was a more fun Oprah moment.
And you get a car, and you get a spec script, and you get a spec script.
Exactly.
Where I'd like to start is your respective backgrounds, because your paths in are quite varied. And I tell my students all the time, it's not like you get an MBA or a law degree and then you go and apply for a job. There are certain ways, I guess you could call them traditional ways to break in, particularly on the TV side of things, but you have a varied background. So I'd like to just explore that if I could, and maybe start with you, Brian. You're from my neck of the woods, I guess a suburb there in Richmond, Virginia, about 60 miles away from University of Virginia, where I went to school. And could you give us an overview of how you went from, like the beat sheet here, of how you went from Richmond, Virginia, and then got an undergraduate degree at UNC Chapel Hill, and then segued 3,300 miles west to Los Angeles?
Sure thing. But first, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. For me, it started when I was a little kid. I loved television, and I was this random kid who had this dream of writing for TV, even in the '90s. So sort of before the kind of the golden age, I guess, of TV. I watched everything. It was all I wanted to do. And so for me, I was fortunate that UNC had a screenwriting program. So I sort of figured that if I went there, maybe there's a chance that it eventually could sort of become my job. And then I got lucky because they also had an internship program in Los Angeles, and so I availed myself of that to the best of my abilities, and came out a week after I graduated in 2004, and I got hired on my internship. So, from there it was. You're right. It was sort of the slow climb, I guess.
Well, Michael Piller was really.
The other thing was Michael Piller is the founder of the UNC screenwriting program in a lot of ways, and he was the showrunner of one of my favorite shows, Star Trek: The Next Generation. So I was familiar with him. My parents made sure that I was familiar with him too, because he was a UNC alumni, so were my parents. And that was where I wound up getting my internship. And my first job was actually as his assistant. So really, in a lot of ways, he was sort of my mentor, and it kind of remains that way. He passed away 2 years into my job working for him. So I was his last assistant, and I had sort of made it my mission to sort of be his last kind of mentee that made it. There's so many writers who had come up under his tutelage before me: Ron Moore, Brandon Braga, Naren Shankar, like on and on and on through like the Star Trek sort of like writing world. And they'd all gone on to like be like showrunners at that point in time, but I got to meet a bunch of them through him. And so for me, from really early on, I was just like, all I wanted to do, especially, I was an assistant for 7 years before I got my first sort of crack at writing for anything, for writing for money, I should say. But for me, I just really wanted to get onto a writing staff. Like I had idolized the writing staff, again, of like Next Generation. I idolized like the X-Files writing staff. And so many of them, or the Buffy the Vampire Slayer one too, and so many of them, they're almost kind of like a basketball team or like a baseball team. I would recognize the names when they came up on screen, and like get excited about different episodes when a different writer was writing it. And I read like every magazine at the time or like website that was sort of about how writers' rooms worked. And like, I just wanted to be a part of it. Like, I just wanted to be on the inside. And so I was lucky as an assistant. I was close. I was like right there knocking on the door. And then, Haven was my first actual writing job. I eventually got a job on that show. What was 2009 or 10? I was the writer's assistant and the script coordinator. And
For anybody out there, please separate those jobs.
yeah, it was
Please,
a lot.
like being a script coordinator and a writer's assistant is a really impossible task to ask somebody to do. And generally, you don't get paid twice. So just any showrunners, anybody who will be a showrunner, please make sure you hire 2 people for that job.
I was excited about monopolizing every opportunity for advancements, so I gladly took on more jobs. And that's kind of the way that I was able to break in, was that whenever there was a little scrap of writing that needed to be done, even when I was an assistant, I worked on 3 or 4 different shows that we produced. A show called Greek on ABC Family, The Dead Zone on USA Network. Whenever there was sometimes it was like, ooh, one of the main characters has like a blog, and so on the website on usanetwork.com, like we're gonna have the blog on there, but like no one wanted to write it, so I was the first one to stick my hand up. And like whenever there was like casting for some like random role, like the writers never want to write like the casting sides, but I was the first one to be like, I'll do it. And so eventually that kind of pays off. And so the second season of Haven, they kicked an episode my direction. I think because they felt so bad for me. I was the first one there every morning. I was the last one to leave, like at night. I was working on weekends. And even like when I wrote my first episode, I was still the assistant and the script coordinator. So I was like proofreading it and everything else. And then I was the one after hours making drop-offs of the script at the doorstep of the network executives, across town, because we couldn't afford the messenger service or whatever. But yeah, and so then I got promoted to the writing staff itself. That was 10 years ago. I've worked on a bunch of shows since then, but it would not have happened were it not for the opportunities that I got through UNC, through the screenwriting program, and then through the internship program that hooked me up with a job out here afterwards. And so I just kind of stuck to my guns from my youth, like all I wanted to do, and so I kind of was either too stubborn or too stupid to do anything different. But I just kind of like stuck to the path, and here I am.
And Liz, you had a different path. I think you're from New York, right? Originally, is that right?
Yeah, I'm from New York and Connecticut.
And I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna. I was a little similar in terms of I really wanted to work in features. Like I wanted to make movies, and from a very young age, but I didn't know what that was. And we were a really big movie household. We didn't watch a lot of TV, except Jeopardy, so thank you, Alex Trebek, RIP. But movies were a big influence to me. And so I went to Pratt Institute undergrad, and there was a film program there. And from there, my mom is from LA. And so every summer in between years in college, I would come out and I would intern in LA. And I worked at a company called Whitewater Films, which is run by Rick Rosenthal. And he had gone to AFI, to the American Film Institute. And he was like, you should go to AFI. You should, both of my parents were like, you can go do this silly thing, work in movies, but you have to get a master's degree, which is, meant I was in debt forever. But and literally not qualified to do anything except work in film or television. But so because of Rick, and I think this thing that's really similar for both of us is that we've both had mentors along the way that have really helped us find our path and stay on our path, and take opportunities when they're offered to us, or make opportunities when they're not. And so because of Rick, I ended up going to AFI. I studied producing there and I got a master's there. And then I was writing, but I didn't think that's what I was going to do. I was way too insecure. I was way too terrified of being personal in my writing, or I also didn't think I was good enough to write. And so I really love producing. Producing is something that I also find very compelling and challenging. And so I started working at a production company called Denver and Delilah Films right out of grad school. And then
Charlize
I
Theron,
was mentored.
right?
Yep, it's Charlize Theron's company.
Yes.
And it was a really tiny company. It was myself and Beth Kono, her producing partner, and like 2 other assistants. And I was there for almost 5 years working in development. And that was really another sort of mentoring experience where kind of about 4 years into it, I was like, I think that I want to write. I think that's what I want to try to do. And I was young and stupid enough to not realize that, it wasn't just going to happen like that. And so I left my job with their full support. They were really encouraging. And I left to write full time, didn't sell anything, you know, I was a writer's assistant on a digital series, and I wasn't writing the things I wanted to write. I wasn't getting my foot in the door the way that I thought I would be able to. And the movie that, excuse me, that I've been talking about for years, that I wanted to write was The Post. And 3 years into this, you know, experience of being an unpaid writer, I was like, I'm going to stop. I'm going to go back to development. Like, maybe this wasn't for me. Maybe I wasn't good enough or don't have what it takes. And Brian was like, maybe you should write that Katharine Graham movie that you've been talking about for 6 years before you quit. So that's why I married him, because he told me to do that. But so I wrote it over the summer, and then kind of the rest, you know, it kind of snowballed from there. And then a year after I sold The Post, I, you know, ironically was able to, or fortunately able to, work with Charlize again on Long Shot and on Mindhunter.
Yeah.
So it all comes back around.
So one thing that I tell my students is that it's extremely competitive. You want to break into this business. I mean, and who knows what the shape of the business is going to be post-pandemic. You know, hopefully it'll rebound in a big way. But you've got to have passion. You got to really want it. And there's an anecdote. I don't know if this is true, Brian, but I believe you gave up your bed from like first grade to, is this right?
Wow.
You basically slept on the floor in front of the TV for your childhood.
Who did you interview? Did you call his mom?
No. I heard a podcast with Brian, and he was talking about this, and I said, now that's commitment. So is that a true story?
It is true. I never thought anything of it until I became an adult, and people were like, "That's not okay." My parents made me. I loved watching TV or movies. You know, I would just watch whatever was on at all hours of the night. And I guess it must have been, it was first grade, and I didn't want to sleep in my room. I wanted to like lay on the floor in front of the television. And my parents were like, "Well, okay, well, if you get good grades, then you can sleep wherever you please." And so I did for the rest of my life. I slept in a bed. I think when we would go on like vacation or something like that, you know, like a hotel.
You got grounded one
But
time.
yeah, but I got grounded in like third grade or something. I'd probably like watch TV instead of doing my homework. And I was grounded, and my punishment was that I had to sleep in my room for the night. My parents,
You were like a POW.
My parents opened the door that night to check on me, because they were like, he must be like, you know, like sleeping like beautifully, like in his bed. The bed was still made. I was asleep on the floor next to the bed.
It was like Homeland.
Like Damien Lewis.
Yeah.
But so I graduated to the couch, you know, and like in high school, that was like a big deal.
But it was a hierarchy thing, because he's the middle of 3 siblings, and all 3 of you slept in front of the television.
We all slept, and then sometimes different TVs, you know, but like, yeah. And we didn't even, my parents were weird. They didn't want to turn the television off. They thought that it took more power, like electricity, to turn it on and off than to just leave it on. And then,
I mean, the TV lasted for like 35 years, so there might be some
actual
actual
for like 17 years and straight, and sort of like bleeding into my brain like at all times. So it's a miracle that I you know, can form complete sentences. But that probably has a lot to do with who I am and where I am now.
Well, it's a great metaphor for the you know, the process of writer's assistant, script writing, working your way up from floor to couch to bed. So, but that you know,
he sleeps in a bed now.
Yeah,
sleeps in a bed.
He sleeps in a bed now.
When I went to college, I had to sleep in a bed to like assimilate into society.
Okay, so UNC helped kind of normalize you in terms of like human relations.
Yeah, but
well, now he can talk about television in UNC.
Yeah.
So he got another thing that he was, you know.
Yeah, but I remember my first day on campus, though. You know, you meet your potluck roommate, and I plunk my television down in the room. He's like, "Oh, I don't watch much TV," and I'm like, "You do now." So, yeah, he does now.
Yes.
Well, so where did the couple? How did you all? You know, I hope, since you're writers, I hope there's kind of a meet cute thing here. But how did you all intersect?
So we actually, I think we're the last couple that we know that met not on like an app, really.
Oh yeah,
of that, because we've been together for almost 8 years, and we were right on that cusp of like everybody's doing Bumble or whatever it is.
It was like OkCupid back then.
Yeah.
We were both circling it, I think.
Yeah, and so we were actually, it was almost exactly 8 years ago, because it was February. we were at a mutual friend's engagement party, and it was a really small engagement party, and it was like him, Brian, his roommate at the time, who also went to UNC and is also a television writer, that some of the staff from Haven, and and then like the families. It was super intimate, and I knew no one except the bride, and Brian basically knew everybody there except the families. So I basically latched on to people who I could talk to, and that ended up being Brian. And so we talked for like 6 or 7 hours. It was back in the days when you could smoke, and it was wonderful.
It was an open bar back there.
It was an open bar.
But I remember we talked about Raiders of the Lost Ark,
Mm.
which is your favorite movie and
Yes.
one of mine too. And I was like, I just loved you. And I couldn't get enough.
And so then he slid into my DMs on Twitter, and then got my number, but did not ask for it. I gave it to you because I was like, I don't want to have the Twitter app on my phone.
You did the hard
open.
work for me. I appreciate that.
Yep. And then we went out, and that was about it. So yeah, we've been together. But I mean, the thing for us was like, I had literally just left my job 2 months before we met. So I was not in a very good place, in really any way. But so he stuck it out.
Well, and it's also like writing wise, it's not like that. I think either of us were specifically looking to date another writer, but I think I kind of was.
Yeah. I mean, I was still having a hard time referring to myself as a writer at
Yeah.
that point, because I had just left to write full time. I was like not confident at all. And so it was kind of one of those things where like,
That's the hardest thing.
I
isn't it?
wasn't owning that yet.
They always say you're supposed to like everyone's like, oh, I want to be a writer, and
It's like,
a
you
lot
are
of
a
times
writer,
they're like,
yeah.
no, say that you are a writer. You know, it's about like kind of owning it. But and I at the time I think I was a staff writer on Haven.
You were a story.
Oh, that's right. So I'd already been on for 2 years, and even I like kind of struggled with that still, with that
Mhm.
like that sort of imposter syndrome. But for me, I think I really I'd hoped that I could maybe meet another writer. I love other writers like so much, and I was working with them like all the time, and so much of the job in particular is one that you like take home. You know,
Mhm.
like you sort of you never have a day off. You know, because even if you're not like actually writing something, like you're probably like thinking about it, or you're guilting yourself about what you're not writing.
Mhm.
And like in my experience had been kind of tough in other relationships for people who didn't work in entertainment or even just weren't writers specifically, just like their schedule and like your rhythms are different. And so I was really excited, not only that I love you, but that we did the same thing, even though we do it kind of differently.
Mhm.
Like that actually was great for both of us, I think.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into the Oprah thing.
Wonderful.
See, Brian says we do it a little differently. What does that mean?
Mhm.
How do you? Okay, you're pandemic. I'm assuming you're staying at home. You're not going into offices, right? Okay, so how
Correct.
does that work? How do you coordinate your writers' lives?
We moved. We moved into a new house. We literally just moved like 2 weeks ago. In our previous house, we shared an office, and we've shared an office for 6 years that we've lived together. And both of us really like it. Like I think Brian coming from working in a writer's room or in an office space, me like my upbringing professionally being in office space, we enjoy having people nearby and being able to turn and talk to somebody and talk it out, and then also glare when you have your headphones on and you're writing and you don't want to talk at that moment. But I opened a writer's room for a limited series in August, and it just was not functional for us to be in the same room. Brian was also pitching on the show, and basically was the ninth staff writer or staff member that we had on the show. So I moved into the guest room because we realized that no one was actually going to be staying in our house as a guest for a while. And then that had doors, which was a benefit for our marriage and our professional lives. And then we just moved where we both have our own offices. So but we're like next to each other. Our offices are right next to each other, so we can still have access. But yeah, in terms of how it works, I mean, Brian is most often in a room. So I feel like you're taking it home is a lot of like pitching me on like what's happened in the room and like trying to work things out, and like if you get stuck on something or if you're developing something, it's talking about like world building and series. I feel like I use you more than you use me, because for me, most of what I do when I'm not doing when I haven't been doing a show is features. And so often for me, features are like I spend, 7 weeks talking about it and thinking about it and complaining about it and watching things and listening to things, and then I'll sit down and actually write it pretty quickly. But there's a very long ramp before I sit down to write, and Brian is is the ramp of that process. So I'm very lucky that he doesn't get bored when I want to talk about those things.
No, and I love, I mean, maybe it's coming up in television of it all, but like I love collaboration. Maybe it's that writing is just a little bit lonely, like in and of itself, or certainly I feel like when any of us get stuck or it's almost always because you're taking too much like on yourself, and like you're putting too much pressure on what you're doing, or you're afraid of screwing it up, whatever it is. But like whenever you've got somebody else and you can like lean on them, I think it always makes it easier. It's all, and just a more pleasant experience. So like I love just kind of kicking around ideas with you the way that we would if we were actually like writing partners.
Yeah.
And we also kind of attack things a little bit differently. Maybe it's because I came up in TV, but I think part of it is just our personalities. Like, yeah, you love that vomit draft that you just kind of like try to like tear through just so you have something finished, even if you're going to rewrite the entire thing. I'm much more like calibrated and like I will outline.
Organized. We'll say he's much more organized.
I came up through TV a little. I think is sort of like I try to like beat it out.
You do a beat sheet and then you do an outline and then
like, structure and that kind of thing. And just in general, that's like almost always what I wind up getting. Like my first whenever like I'm whether it's a pilot or anything else. It's always they're like, wow, there's so much plot, or like it's so well structured. They're like, we're just looking for a little bit more character. I'm like, I know it's gonna be there. And then you, on the other hand, you're like, I just wrote this like 17-page scene, like, and it's like the most amazing like character and like voice stuff ever. And you're like, I'm gonna figure out like the plot and the structure and everything later, but I'm just feeling it out.
Yeah.
And so you and I kind of come at it from.
You sometimes refer to it as free jazz.
Yeah, free jazz. The showrunner that I worked on the first show that I wrote on. He would crack his knuckles over the keyboard of your script and say, like, I'm about to do some free jazz. Just get in there and just start going crazy. You're like, what are you doing? But you're kind of like the same. But it's a little bit like, left brain, right brain, like, art versus math, I guess, like I would like to think that we've been a good influence on each other.
Yeah.
We're sort of begun to meet in the middle. I'm now, putting it off and trying to write a vomit draft. And you're now, I don't think I haven't noticed you breaking things down, a little more.
I'm not happy about it. I'm not pleased, but it turns out that it does make your life easier when you know what you're writing to.
Yeah.
So,
but it also I think really helps that you and I generally don't really write the same kind of things. Like I love I love everything that you've written, and we watch all the same sort of stuff. But like I've written almost entirely like genre type television. If there's like a vampire or a werewolf or like a time machine, like I'm usually in it or there. And like, but I could never have written The Post. I couldn't have written Mindhunter, like those are not in like my wheelhouse necessarily. But, and you probably,
well, I think that's the same thing. Like
I'm writing Teen Wolf the way that I did.
Well, I wouldn't know how to. I mean, I think what's really great, and it goes to, it's almost like a built-in writer's room that we have, and going to our specific strengths and weaknesses is also, I think we are self-aware enough to acknowledge our own strengths and weaknesses. Like I am very aware that plot is not my strength, and that I would much rather write a 17-page of people talking and then something happens than kind of have to figure that out. So it's helpful to have Brian, who also, we read each other's first drafts, we read each other's vomit drafts for the most part. But it is helpful to have somebody, though I'm not always the most receptive at the time, to say like, this doesn't make sense. And I will be like, well, it will soon. And Brian will be like, but how? And then I may storm off into the office, but generally he's right. So it is helpful to have that.
And I'm fortunate that I get to read all your first drafts. I mean, and I read all the other drafts after that point too. But like I will never write character or dialogue as well as you, no matter how hard I try. But I always feel like I get a little bit better at my like weak areas. Like every time I like get to read something like of yours. So like it's I get the best end of the bargain.
I paid him to say those things.
But yeah, so it's rewarding professionally and obviously personally.
Well, thank you.
So it's interesting to see, that you've got these varied approaches to writing, even the areas of interest. I know I've interviewed Liz before, and we talked about how important characters are to her. I mean, how she's really drawn to that. And Brian, I follow you on Twitter. I encourage everybody to follow both of you on Twitter. And there was a tweet you had once, let's see if I can find it, where you basically were saying, just give me a sec. Oh, here it is. When writing is emotion first and centered around the characters, it's a winner. So clearly you feel strongly about characters as well. So let me ask both of you, how much do the characters drive your process, the creative process and the story crafting process?
For me, it's entirely. I think somebody was asking recently about Mindhunter and the Charles Manson scene, which I was a part of the writing process for that, and was asking, is it hard to write an evil person? Does empathy become a part of it? And always my answer is empathy is the biggest thing. When you're writing characters, you have to have empathy. That doesn't mean that you condone what they do. That doesn't mean you like them, but you have to, in my opinion at least, in order to write a three-dimensional character, live in their shoes a bit. And I think Mindhunter is a really interesting it was a phenomenal experience and really interesting experience in that it's very subtle and a very long game. It's a slow burn, and a lot of the season was leading up to, for one of the characters, for Tench, Holt McClaney's character in particular, was leading up to this Manson scene and this conversation. And though there is an enormous amount of exposition in that scene and an enormous amount of Manson-y stuff, the intention wholly behind that scene was to push Tench's character to a place, off a ledge, that he was teetering on a ledge for 5 episodes and he needed to be pushed over, and that was what the intention of the scene was. And so and all of that comes from character. We knew that he had to get to a breaking point. We knew that, so that's plot. Your character has to change in some way and your story has to move in some way, but it was really driven by emotion and character that he needed to be pushed that way. And so the scene that was so much fun, and I could just write, I will not tell you how long many drafts of that scene was. That scene actually was 17 pages. And I think that was what it came down to after many, many, many drafts. But you can get lost in how much fun it is to write somebody who's so, Manson is so larger than life and such a caricature that it's so challenging to write somebody and make them feel real. That is a caricature and is infamous in that way. But it was really fun to realize, kind of after a year of writing it, that we were like, oh, this is what the scene has to do, and it's to push Tench. So for me, it's constantly driven by that.
I would co-sign all that. What's crazy is what I think that was the 17-page scene that I was referring to. Like, if I had to write a scene that was 17 pages, like I would die someplace, probably around like page 5 or 6. I don't think I've ever written a scene that was like longer than 4 pages. In TV, certainly like commercial television, like I came up on, like that you live in pursuit of the perfect 1.5 pager. Like that's the perfect like length of the scene. Like it's have a little chuffer at the top, and then there's like a little turn in the scene, and then you're out as quickly as possible. It's always come in as late as possible, get out as early as possible, that kind of thing. Like, and whenever I would have a scene that was 2 pages or getting close to 3, my showrunners would be like, what are you doing? Like, what is this? Like, do you think we got time for this? Like, like, no one's gonna want to shoot this. No one's gonna want to watch this. So like, I wouldn't even know where to begin. That's like a 1-act play that you were writing. And by the way, over and over and over again, however many drafts that we did. But the theory behind it still remains the same, which is, the scene, you can sort of like break down every scene into like its own kind of movie, like what's it really about, what's actually happening, and there's a math kind of quality to it, like too, like, and then how does that scene sort of set up the next scene, and like and on and on and on, and then even something as big as that does the same thing.
Well,
For me though, but like emotion wise, like character wise, like that's, I mean, ironically, that's why I was as into genre television as I was. For me, I found that to be my favorite sort of genre stories are the most emotional ones. Quantum Leap was my favorite show like as a little kid, you know, because like I would cry every episode, and like the time travel like would help you do that. Like Arrival a couple years ago, like I
oh,
just
so good.
loved, and like that movie would be devastating or heartbreaking if there weren't aliens and whatever like timey wiminess that there is, but that like enhances it. And so for me, like it's actually it's like it's the sort of the big-hearted genre that I've always been like after.
Well,
But
we both grew up in the Amblin era.
yeah,
Like, I mean, I think we're kids of the 80s. We grew up in where genre was E.T. and Close Encounters and Jaws, and you know, that was what was the bread and butter of what we grew up on. And I feel like I've talked about this a lot, and we've talked about it. Like E.T. to me is the perfect example of tricking everyone into watching a movie about a family that has to come back together, because at that ET is actually just sort of a device, and ET's great and he's cute and he's adorable and we love him. But the point of the movie is the first 15 minutes when dad has just left, mom has two jobs, everybody is that they're devastated, they don't know what to do. And at the end of the movie, they've come back together and realized how to become a family again because an alien showed up. The alien is just the way to get
it's a
there.
device.
And so, in going back to your original question, Scott, is that we all think about ET and we say like, oh, it's so fun and ET's so cute and we love that he gets to go home again and it's so sad in the end. But it's completely driven by character. It's driven by the fact that mom and the three kids have to come back together and find a way to become this new family unit that wasn't the family unit they had 3 days ago. And without that, without the emotional wreckage that you enter into this family in the beginning of the movie, then it doesn't really land in the end when ET leaves like dad, and they all have to be back together again alone, but they're okay now.
Yeah, and I guess more granularly for television, something I always think about. It was probably one of the ways that I got promoted on Haven in the first place, which that was sort of like an X-Files in a small town kind of shows based on a Stephen King book. But in season 1, we had a problem on the show. They came up with all these ideas for different supernatural monsters of the week. You know, we had a whole like a closet full of them, or different ideas that were trotting out, and there was something that was sort of amiss in the show. And there was a writer named Jose Molina, who was like me, a devotee of Buffy, and he sort of identified what the problem was really early on, and he and I kind of began to try to tackle it, which was that it wasn't being driven by the characters and by like the emotion. It was being driven by like the supernatural like ideas, and like it can't nothing, whether it's an episode of an episodic type show or a season of Stranger Things, like it can't work that way. And so what he and I did at this sort of halfway through the first season, we were like, what if we tried it the Buffy way? And so what if we figured out, and sometimes it was hard, sometimes it was easy, what if we figured out like what's an emotional problem that our characters are having? Let's not talk about like monsters or supernatural curses or anything. Like what is the problem that our characters are feeling? Like what kind of like pain are they going through like emotionally? And once we figure out that storyline, then we can just invent any sort of supernatural thing. Any monster of the week can help us tell that story. Like it's going to either make that problem worse for your character, or it's going to force them to confront the thing that they're like not saying, you know. And we'll figure out the supernatural thing, whatever the monster is, whatever the Stephen King, you know, type of thing. Like that's kind of the easy part. It's the fun part, but you have to start with like what's actually going on with the characters first, and then everything else like takes care of itself.
Yeah, I got a few comments real quick on. I was reminded there's a quote, right? Even bad guys have moms.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so if you're dealing with a nemesis character, you got to, you know, they're the protagonist in their story, you know.
Yep.
So walk a mile in their shoes. Another thing, Eric Heiser is going to be here later on today talking about Arrival.
Love Heiser.
Oh.
Yeah. So we're
Great guy.
excited about that. And then I'm just reminded, boy, Brian, what you were just saying reminds me of that great TED talk that Andrew Stanton did. I don't know if you've ever seen it. And he said like one of the primary commandment for writers is to make me care. The audience, make the audience care. because if you don't do that, then the action is meaningless. And if you do that, then you can go pretty much anywhere. And so maybe just get your reaction to that comment there from Andrew Stanton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. If it's kind of the, when you're reading, right, when you're that if you are not invested within the first 15 pages, then you're not gonna, if you don't get a reader invested in within the first 15 pages, they're not gonna read to the end. And I've been reading scripts for almost 20 years now, and it's absolutely true. And it goes for television and film as well. Is like, if I'm not invested with it, if for film and television is even shorter, if I'm not invested for like 7 minutes, then it's going to be a hard won battle to get me there throughout. And I think the challenge is to make it, for me, the challenge is to have an audience commit and be invested, but have it be unique while also being universal. Like, I don't want an audience to just invest because they're like, oh, it's X, Y, and Z, and it's a really easy way to get a character. You know, it's sort of like schmuck baity, you know, like I don't want somebody to invest like a pity investment in a character or a pity investment in a story. I want them to invest because they're emotionally, truthfully moved or connected to something. And that's what's harder. That is a much harder like challenge to undertake. But I think it's much more rewarding than, you know, just sort of, oh, it's a funny character, I like them.
I agree. And I don't think it takes much, you know, like you know it when you're there, and you know it when you're watching something and it feels like, you know, you're 20 minutes in, and whether it's a movie or a TV show, and it feels like you didn't get that moment like earlier on where, and sometimes, you know, it's just like we were just watching The Kingsman, the first one this morning, you know, and sure, you've got some stuff with, like, you know, a guy dies in service and stuff earlier on, but it's really all about when you meet Taron Egerton's character and you see what a terrible home life he has. And then when he goes and like steals a car and does like the wrong thing, he tells his friends to like get out of the car so they don't get arrested too. Like, it doesn't take much. And then you understand, you know so much about him just from that. Like, it's just it's about finding these relatable moments for people. And it's almost always, you know, they're kind of in a hard luck situation, or they're unhappy about something and they just kind of need a chance. And then, you know, miraculously that chance is going to like come along, you know, like it's, but you have to, whether it's a villain or a hero, like it's just about making them relatable. And sort of, for me, I always sort of talk about like identifying like the pain that they're kind of going through, particularly with villains. I think in a lot of the shows that I've worked on, I've wound up getting kicked a lot of like the villain monologues or like the villain scenes. I don't know if that's a good thing.
Do you want to tell us something?
No, but for me, it's because I espouse a lot, Scott, like what you were saying, is that like, sure, they're the heroes of their own stories, but it's also like the best villains are ones that maybe you don't sympathize with, but you can empathize with. That's what you're saying too, you know. And so it's that, you know, something happened in their life that made them this way, and like they have conviction in what they're doing. I mean, they don't, it just doesn't sort of work. And that's true on both sides of the coin, the hero like or villain. It's just about figuring out like how the audience and you yourself, when you're writing it, like would relate to them and sort of sympathize and care about them, and you're cool.
We got to have some reader questions, guest questions, student questions here in just a bit, but one of them, let's see, where did it go? I guess it disappeared. But basically they're asking, and we have to talk about this, Liz, the post. That whole experience, because I was tracking that, you know, I've got the blog, right? And so I'm tracking, and Brian, I know you were intimately involved in this because you were the one that said, you've got to write this story on Catherine Graham, right? You know, so let's just kind of walk through that history real quickly, because it's like, you write the script, Amy Pascal calls you on a weekend, I think it is, in October.
It was it was like a Friday night. So Brian was actually in New York shooting Time After Time.
Yeah, a short-lived, God bless it, ABC show.
And so I had the script. I had written the script. I was a company called Starthrower Entertainment was attached to produce it.
You pitched it, the idea to them years.
I had pitched the idea like 3 years earlier.
Random general.
Yeah, and then I was, you know, it's always one of those things. I was too afraid to write it. I was, you know, thought I wasn't good enough. All of the things, you know, I'm afraid of failure, all of those things. And then the second you do it, the thing you're afraid of, usually good things happen.
Yeah, well, and they weren't going to pay you to write it, but they were like, that's a great idea, write it and bring it back, and like, let's take a look at it when you get around to writing.
So I had spec'd it, and I didn't have an agent. I had my managers and my lawyer, and I really, from that script, just wanted a job. That was all I wanted. Like, I just wanted to get another job. the movie was, the script was, a period piece about a woman finding her voice at age 55. There's no sex. There's a lot of talking, and it's also it's not even a paper chase because the thing they're looking for has already been published.
Yeah.
So it's like
it's
really,
found.
it was chef's kiss, everything that everybody was looking for. I was like, no one is ever going to make this, and if they do, it'll be like a tiny little movie. But whatever. I just want to talk. I was looking for an agent, and I had met with a few different agencies. They'd read the script. The script was sort of going around, and people were really liking it. But I was kind of, I was, this was my last shot at it. So I was pretty detached in terms of like, oh, I'm glad people like it. I really didn't have any kind of understanding of what was going on. And then it got slipped to a few different studios on a Thursday night. A friend of mine who worked at Fox at the time when Stacey Snider was running the company texted me on a Thursday night and was like, oh, my boss has the script on the plane. And I was like, great. And then 2 hours later, he was like, Stacey's reading it. And I was like, Stacey who? And he was like, Stacey Snider. And I was like, I hope she likes it. That's so lovely. Like, I didn't have any real concept. And then
I remember you freaking out about it.
But I didn't think any.
Cool. It was pretty.
No, I was not. I'm not cool. I was definitely not cool. But I didn't think it was like she was going to read it and make it. I was just like, that's awesome that Stacey Snider was reading it. I had been a huge fan of Stacey's, and it was just like, it was a very flattering thing.
But
it was going.
But you just at the time you were just hoping that some agents would read it. Maybe
Yeah.
one of them would sign you.
Yeah, it was just like, I would really love an agent, and I'd love to like go.
And you
get
had,
a job.
You had a couple maybe meetings at some smaller agencies that were like kind of lined up, but that was it. And suddenly it was being read like everywhere. It was crazy. Like it was like
from Thursday night
early
to
Jerry Maguire. It was like just a mission statement, but suddenly like everybody had it the next morning.
It was like from Thursday night to Friday afternoon. It felt like everyone in town was reading it, and there were offers coming in. And then Amy Pascal ended up coming in and buying it. And she called me at midnight. My manager called me and said, Amy bought the script. She wants to call you. And I was like, okay, sure. It was midnight. I was like in bed. Brian was in New York. I had been texting him to keep him updated, but he was on location. He didn't have service, and it was like 3 a.m. in New York. And then
I stayed up all night.
Yeah. We were all awake, and then Amy called me, and it was the first of many late night phone calls I've had with Amy. And she was like, so I bought this, we're gonna make this movie. Sound good? And I was like, okay, Amy Pascal. And that was October of 2016.
The script made the blacklist.
And then, and so then like a month, 6 weeks later, it made the blacklist. It ended up, Stacey Snider at Fox ended up coming on and partnering and being our studio. And we went to a few different directors. Steven Spielberg was never in the running because he was prepping another movie. And also I'm like, yeah, Steven Spielberg will direct my movie. That was not in the reality of my world. And so we'd gone to a few other directors. Important thing about this being 2016 also is that the election happened right after I sold the script to Amy. It was 1 week later. And we were convinced that Hillary was going to win, as I think the majority of the world was convinced. And when she didn't win, there was this moment where I was like, does anyone want to see a movie about a woman winning? Like, were we just told that this is not something? And Amy, to her credit, is like, we have to make this movie even more now. And again, that was what was relevant at that point. The power of the press, the freedom of the press, and the importance of the press was not even in the conversation at this point, because we didn't know what was about to happen. And so Trump takes office in January. After he's inaugurated, he begins to, kick the press out of the White House, out of the West Wing. Obviously, the press briefings, which, like, God bless Jen Psaki. I'm her biggest fan. I'm watching these things every day. It's like I'm like getting my popcorn. I'm just like, Jen, tell me what's going on. It's just so lovely to see you up there. but so it was, it was chaos. And so what had been happening in November, December, and up before January 20th, was when we would send it to directors, the directors would pass and say, we don't know how this is relevant. We don't think it's relevant now. And we were like, it's relevant. It's about to be even more relevant. We didn't even know how relevant. And then a sort of confluence of events happened. Stephen, the movie that he was prepping, the lead was a 9-year-old boy that he couldn't cast. He couldn't find like the perfect kid, which I've had a running joke that like I found the kid and I kidnapped him and I put him in like, I like hid him away. And so I didn't do that, but it would have been a good joke. So he couldn't find the kid. Tom Hanks sent to the press room at the White House, which he does every 4 years. It just happened to be this year. I had seen it. He sent an espresso maker with a quote on a Post-it from Ben Bradley. And Meryl Streep gave a very big speech outlining the importance of the press.
Oh my
and
gosh, was that the Golden Globes?
No, I don't remember where it was. No, because by then it was like something else was happening. But so she gave this very big speech about like the importance of the press. And so all three of them kind of right after Inauguration Day and as this started snowballing, just kind of there was a zeitgeisty alignment. And over a weekend, Stephen and Tom and Meryl all read the script. They all signed on, and we were in production 9 weeks later.
So like literally, I think it's if the timing, 16 months it sells, and then 16 months later, you and Brian are at the premiere. Is that right? It was like that, like not even a year and a half.
It was like, yeah, it was like 14 months, which in the 14 months, we also got married. And you were in Toronto doing Shadowhunters. I was in Montreal doing Long Shot and Mindhunter. That was the next year.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a busy 14 months. But yeah, I sold it. They signed on. We were in production. Sorry, it was 10 weeks later. We shot the movie in 9 weeks, and the movie came out in December.
Yeah, you can't toot your own horn, so I will for you. You glossed a little bit over like the sale of it all, and the reason why I think that it did ultimately, it wasn't like super expensive. You didn't write something that was like set in space, that would have cost like $100 million to make. Like there was a version of it that we thought maybe someone will make it and it'll be like a little tiny movie. That didn't happen. But even though it was a period piece, it was like really contained. There's there's a bunch of really good roles, but it was two really good roles for actors, of a certain age who were looking for that type of role. So I think mercenarily, I think it was a really smart thing for you to have written. The other thing which you not everybody can do, but you nailed it, was that it was just also super well written. Like I still remember reading, because remember, like it was early that summer.
There was 165 page. What he's getting at is there was originally a 165 page draft, which sweet baby Brian had to read, and he was like, "Do we need all of this?"
So many drafts of it.
Yeah.
When it was called the papers, and then it was the post.
Well, it was the post, and then it was the papers, and then it was the post, and then ironically, when we were in production, it was called the papers, and then it was called the post. Yeah. It was your title.
I told you so.
It was your title. I understand. Yeah.
But there was your original script opened with that breakfast scene between Kay and Ben. That was shocker. It was like 10 pages long. But like I would read that and I'd like have to set the script down afterwards. And I was like, I could never write something so what like their voices just like jumped off the page. And you understood everything you needed to about the two of them, just in how their banter and their bickering, and like it was.
Brian doesn't like it when I write married couples. Well, it's a little upsetting.
Well, and that's how they kind of were written, sort of.
Yeah.
They were kind of in an arranged marriage in a sense. I mean, what do you used to call it? It was a romantic comedy. Like
it's a non-romantic love story.
Correct.
Yeah, a platonic love story. Yeah.
But so it was just sort of undeniable, and like for all the things that you said. That were knocks against it. Like when you read it, it was undeniable. But it was just a fun read.
Well, thanks, honey.
One of our students, I think, has got a question here, Holly Dodd, that she'd like to ask live. That's, I think, a nice way to kind of follow up on the post. So, Holly, if you're there.
Yeah. So how do you write historical characters when they're real people, and how do you go about historical fiction in that way? Because I am also a primarily historical fiction writer.
Um, Great question. Very carefully. Um, I think for me, specifically to the post, I was writing it at my kitchen table thinking it was never going to get made. And I use what I kind of stumbled upon after many attempts during the writing process of that, a research process and a writing process that I've now done subsequently in a number of true stories, which is I consume. I have an amazing assistant who served as my research assistant, and she and I basically make a list of everything that that person has ever been in they've ever been written about, anything they've ever written, any documentary, any interview, anything that they've ever had any touch of, and I consume it over the course of depending on how quickly the deadline is, either a very long time or a very short time. Um, and I try and understand who the person is. And it kind of goes back to what Brian was saying about like, a villain has pain too. I'm really looking for when I'm doing this, like, who is this person? What is their pain? What is their joy? What are their struggles? With the post, truly the way that that movie came out, the structure of it was, I wanted to write about Catherine Graham. I was obsessed with her and her memoir, Personal History, which if you haven't read, you should read. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. It's one of the most amazing memoirs I've ever read. And her life, she has like 15 different lives. There were a number of other movies that could have been written about her. There were a number of TV shows of limited. There was actually a really long time where I was like, is this a limited series? Because there was just so much life lived. And it wasn't until I was reading Ben Bradley's book that I realized, oh, it's about this sort of superhero team. It's not just about Kay, it's about the two of them and how they became the team that allowed Watergate to happen. And so it was that process. So in the research process was actually how I found that. But I do the research, I read everything, I consume everything, and then I put it away. And then I don't think about it. I distance myself from it, and I write and break and structure whatever the movie is based on the character that I have investigated and discovered and and found through this. Found is also a word for discovered in this process. Then I go back and I vet it with my research to make sure it's historically accurate. The biggest thing for me is that the character on the page and the character on screen should have integrity to be recognizable by the loved ones or people familiar with them as a real person. You're never going to be in the room. You're never going to be, I wrote a movie that took place on Air Force One a few years ago, and there were a lot of conversations that it was on one day on Air Force One, and there were a lot of conversations I knew about that happened. There were a lot of closed door conversations, and I needed to be able to portray those in the movie. Well, I did enough research and I talked to enough people that I was like, I probably have a good sense of what they talked about in that movie and in that closed room. So I could pretty confidently say, I know who these people are. I know that what they would say to each other. I know how they would react to each other, and you can create from there. But it's extremely important to me that when you're writing about historical figures, that they are recognizable to people who know them. And the most flattering thing to me about the post is having people who knew Kay and then come up and say like it was like she was there. And that is the most, that I think is truly your responsibility as a writer when you're writing about true people and true stories.
We've got a question here from Julia Meese, who would like to know, and maybe Brian, you could lead with this. Are there more discoveries you find about the characters the more drafts you write, or are your rewrites geared more toward refining structure?
Let's say it's probably a little bit of both, but honestly, I think it is about the refining, but in a lot of ways, it's refining to sort of figure out what you're missing in that sort of character sort of department. Like you'll find a lot of times that you're maybe a little bit deficient, or that you've you've maybe underserved a character like here or there. I mean, we're watching shows or movies where that's still happened even through shooting and editing. I mean, you're like, man, I just wish that we had spent 5 more minutes with them earlier. Like, did you go home with them, or did you deal with it? And again, doesn't sometimes it's a little dialogue free sort of snippet. You just need them to the cliche, right? Is they splash water in their face in the bathroom and stare at themselves in the mirror.
Which I found out is a real thing recently, by the way, that it does apparently like trigger some type of response. I always thought it was like people in movies and TV do this. It's so silly. Apparently splashing cold water on your face like relaxes you. So just a hot tip. We should have been doing it for a long time.
I think about a random snippet all the time from the making of Serenity, the movie based on the Firefly TV show. They went back and did some reshoots, and the one moment that they added is really early in the movie, right before like the plot gets started, like around Act 1 or whatever. And people sort of, I guess, in the test screenings felt like they weren't connecting to Nathan Fillion's character enough, and they identified the problem was that people didn't understand that he was he was the main character. And so all they went back and did was they put a few boxes up against the wall, and he turns to, they just shot this quick snippet between him and another character where he asked the one character, like, "Are you ready?" And then she asked him, "Are you?" And then you hold on Nathan Fillion's face for like 3 or 4 seconds as he like kind of contemplates like the strange weight of that question. And then we just go on with the movie. And they added that in, and then they never got that note again. It was just this one little moment. And that's the kind of thing that maybe when you're going back and rewriting that you can sort of find that you're not either connecting with somebody or you just kind of don't have it. And whether it's like their baby keeps crying in the next room and they just feel overwhelmed by it all, like whatever it is, you just need something where you see they're struggling, or see that they're going through something, or that they're about to go through something. And I think that's what you wind up finding when you're back through, is that you need a little bit more character sort of sprinkled throughout.
For me, it's always I find the characters, the more I write and the more drafts I do, because of the vomit draft and because I'm less organized than Brian, I don't generally have a full sense of, I usually have like a sense of who the character is and what their journey is, but I sometimes don't know all of their intricacies and how to express it. I just wrote a movie based on Lee Miller, who's a photojournalist during World War II. And if you don't know about her, you should look her up. She's amazing. But I sort of like, she was kind of an anomaly to me. I couldn't figure her out. Like, she was feisty, but insecure, but confident, and sexy, but committed. Like she's just a contradiction of a character. And I was just writing this one scene, and a line of dialogue like sort of came out. And as I wrote the line of dialogue, I was like, oh, that's who she is. And it was sort of just in this conversation, and it was actually somebody else saying it about her. And I was like, oh, and I mean, this is not recommended. I was on page like 75 when this line of dialogue came out. So I had to definitely go back and rewrite. But it's just free jazz. Free jazz. It's a slalom. But that sometimes happens, and then you just go back and do it.
That we refer to that line as like your sea crystal, and then suddenly everything else made sense around that.
Yeah.
So you kind of had to like rewrite the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But you figured it out, and by the way, and you nailed her voice.
Appreciate it.
We've got a question here. Matt Rogers would like to ask a question live. Matt, you want to go ahead and ask it?
Hello. Okay, so Long Shot was like seriously one of my favorite movies of 2019. I loved it. My brother saw it in theaters. He saw it in theaters and texted me immediately. He was like, go to the theater right now. Go see this movie. You're gonna love it. And I loved it so much because it just like, it was this traditional rom-com full of these traditional conventions, but it was so like turned on its head and all unique. And so I wondered what advice you have for delivering these genre conventions that the audience expects while still delivering something wholly unique.
Well, thank you so much. It was you who saw the movie in theaters. I've been looking for you. There had to be one. It was funny. I really love that movie. It has like a very, very special place in my heart. And that movie really came out. So it was Dan Sterling was my co-writer, and Jonathan Levine, the director, and Seth Rogen, the actor, producer, and amazing writer in of his own. The plot of the movie existed. It was very, I think, as you said, it was kind of a typical rom-com structure of like ooh, twist, she was his babysitter. And the four of us also were just really deep romantic comedy nerds. Like, we talked about Notting Hill constantly. And while we were writing the movie, I didn't know the guys at all. I had just wrapped the post and came in, and we were sort of rewriting the movie to be in production in like 3 months. And we were getting to know each other, and a lot of what we talked about was our spouses, or my fiance at the time, and then I was getting married 3 months later. And it was kind of just bonding and getting to know each other and realizing that we were the Flarskys in our relationships. And we were like, huh, we're really lucky they married us. And so this is a roundabout way of saying, like, I think it came really the way that movie, and one of the reasons it has a special place in my heart, is it really came from a genuine place of us all talking about marrying our best friends, and the reality that you don't see that often. That's broadcast news. What did we just watch the other day? When Harry Met Sally, Notting Hill. A lot of these movies, they're so wonderful. Broadcast news, I know she doesn't end up with anybody in the end, but regardless, like, it's about finding your best friend. It's about finding the person you're safest with. It's about, it's the characters. And it just happened that Holly Hunter is safest with herself, and bitch doesn't need a man. I'm all about it. So I think for us, it was like, let's just write a movie that is like about our relationships, and let's write a movie about real people and how you kind of up all the time and you never really say the right thing, and that's okay, because that person gets you more than anybody else, and you want to be the person that you want that person to be the person you tell everything to and you spend your time with. And so that, it was really just that. It was like, we just kind of wanted to write like a movie about our spouses and hope that because we wrote a movie about them, they wouldn't divorce us, because we're not home for a very long time.
Do you all have time for a couple more questions? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Of course.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. So we've got a question here from Kristen Estes, who would like to know, you've both talked a lot about your writing process and the importance of character and figuring out plot. I was wondering what role theme plays in your writing process, especially Brian, because sci-fi fantasy tends to be an especially thematic motivated genre. So you want to talk about theme and how important it is in your writing?
It's funny. It's a really good question. I think it's pretty important to sort of be able to kind of call back to it when you need it, but that it's not something necessarily that you would have like on the forefront of your mind. It's funny, like I'm working on a show pilot for a series with a studio right now, and I had this whole thing about, the theme was about like selfishness in American society, and like, like sort of like the modern problem with today is that everyone, like, doesn't want to help their neighbor. It was a beautiful comment about, sort of like the why this show I'm writing right now, which was a horror show, is like relevant to today. And the studio was like, it's great what you wrote. And we're not saying it's not. We're just saying that we don't need it. We just want you to cut it entirely. It's like, everything? They're like, everything. And they're like, if someone asks you about the theme, then you can talk about that, but like, just don't have that in the pitch. And I was like, oh, I hear you. And so again, I think it's good for you to have it. It was a good note, because it's good for you to have that sort of idea, but kind of just like in your back pocket, or to have something. And I think it's, you and I talk about this a lot. It's, if anything, it's to answer the why now sort of question, and particularly with a sci-fi or a genre sort of thing, like a lot of times it's not at face value something that's relevant to today, like you could have made The Expanse, that the wonderful show, like at any time period, but sort of that show speaks to sort of what's going on in our society in a lot of ways. Like today, Battlestar kind of did that, in the
Handmaid's Tale. I mean,
yeah, Handmaid's Tale, but like, they were all written at different times or created at different times. It's about kind of finding why now, and then kind of keeping it, I think, at times kind of to yourself, but never losing sight of that, because I think it's tough to write or do anything right now that isn't in some way, shape, or form speaking to or reflecting the like massive problems with our world and our society. Like it would just be tough for it to be a serious, like weighty kind of thing, and for it to ignore it. Even Long Shot was super fun, and as light. And
I hope Biden does some hostage negotiations on MDMA. I think it'll be really fun for us. Bring some fun back to the White House.
But I think it's good to have the theme, but maybe you don't have to, certainly don't need to like put it front and center. But it's good to have it so that you have it and you know it.
Okay, we got time for one last question here. Let me go and find that. It's George Slad. There's a question he'd like to ask live. So George, what do you got?
Hello. So as writers, what do you find most beneficial to your productivity? You talked about having each other in the same room and working together like that. Is that in particular something? Is there anything else in addition to that?
Not having each other in the same room at times is also important. I mean, I think productivity, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, is really hit or miss. And I think, we've had to give ourselves some grace in the process of like, it's a pandemic for, a year of that almost entirely. The United States was being run by a monster, or I use run in air quotes. There's a lot going on. So I think giving yourself a break sometimes and being like, today is too much. It's not going to happen today. Is important. In terms of productivity in a normal time when there's not a pandemic and the threat of all-out war, I think it's still kind of the same thing. I work really well with deadlines. Both of us do. Like we both really thrive under a deadline because both of us have a master's degree in procrastination. So having them, like, even if it's self-imposed with each other, it's really important. And I think knowing that we're both writers and respecting each other's time. So knowing that if I send Brian something to read, if I send him a draft, that's 2 hours of his time that he's taking away from his work to read something that I've done, and vice versa. So I want to make sure that when he's planning his time to sit down and read it, that I'm not wasting it. So I think holding yourself to deadlines is really, really important for both of us. I also think setting yourself up for success to be productive is really important. If you sit down and, there's whatever the hell is going on and you're distracted and you're like, today's the day I write 10 pages, you're not going to write 10 pages. You're not going to get done what you need to get done if you're distracted. So I think setting your, I have like a whole, like I light a candle, I turn my internet off, I sit down, I have some coffee, and then I just have to do it.
Yeah, this has been tough writing wise for me in the pandemic because I used to love writing in coffee shops. Like I kind of loved the din of the place, the people talking at the table next to you. Haven't been to one of those since March. And same, I used to always work in an office place, and so it sort of forced you to work. And I'm terrible at setting deadlines for myself, but to echo what you said, I think being responsible to somebody else is really important, and a lot of people have like writers groups that kind of give that to them. And even if not, then like have a friend or a spouse who, and whether they're a writer or not, but just that you have sort of promised that and hopefully they promise that they'll read it, like get something to them, or that you talk about it with them, like I'm always comforted when I realize that even like the best writers, William Goldman or Aaron Sorkin or whoever, like nobody does it alone. Like they have people who they show stuff to. They have people that they send stuff to. Like it's about having that. So A, you don't feel quite so defeated by the process, and B, so that you're being like held to some kind of a deadline, because otherwise you'll just tinker and write or research to.
Well, and it's about finding what your process is. Like Sorkin showers like 5 times a day. Like when he gets stuck, he goes and he showers. And, when I get stuck, I'll go for a walk, or I'll go sit outside, or, I'll work on something else, or, whatever it is. And so you kind of just have to find out what your process is and stick to it, and know that like if you're stuck, it's not like I'm going to go spend 4 hours on Twitter now, because like that's a way I get in. I know that if I go on Twitter, I'm not going to be productive. So like I'm not going to lie to myself and say that this is a useful use of my time. But instead of going on Twitter, if I go like sit outside, or I go walk the dog, or I like go clean the kitchen, or do something active where I'm listening to a podcast, my brain is running, then I actually will end up usually going back into it. But
And then for me also, there's something that I think about framing sometimes and hanging up over my desk. A writer named Rich Haddam, who I worked with once, would say it all the time. His mantra was "Let it suck." And like that's the hardest thing for me sometimes. Is I sort of we'll get stuck on something, or we'll think about something to death, and I should just like let it suck and just do the bad version, and then you can go back and fix it later. It's better to have something than to have nothing.
Well, it's
and and so a lot of times, my productivity, like you get stuck, writing the same scene or paragraph, or trying to do something like endlessly, and like just like move on. Just like let it suck.
Yeah, well, it's finished is better than perfect.
Yeah,
you can always get it better.
What nice comment here wow, this seems like the best marriage ever.
Thanks.
That's really
Brian, I did a blog article on this app you can get that recreates coffee house sounds. So you can literally, you can add espresso noises. So I'll try and send that to you.
Okay. That sounds great. Please do.
Now, is this right? I think, Liz, did you tell me that this is the first time you two have been interviewed together? Is that right or no?
Yeah, this is our first interview together. Yeah.
Well, you should do it more often because you all are great.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much.
Well, we've only been talking to each other for 10 months, so we've had a lot of practice.
That's great.
We basically give ourselves we practice interviews constantly, just the two of us and our dog, who I thought was going to make an appearance, but I don't know where she went.
Well, so congrats on the new house, and most importantly, go Tar Heels tonight when they play Duke Blue Devils. That you're wearing your Tar Heel blue. There you go.
Go Heels.
Normally, being a Cavalier fan, I normally don't root for the Tar Heels, but whenever it's anybody but Duke,
Exactly.
Today we're fighting the evil empire, so we're all.
Well, listen, I got to wrap up here. Just give me see if I can find this document. Thank you so much to Liz and Brian for taking the time to speak with us today. To send them a thank you, show your appreciation, to keep up with them. You can follow them on social media. You can find Liz on Instagram and Twitter at It's Liz Hannah, and you can find Brian on Twitter, B Millikin, Millikin. We have a break, but come back for Adapting Arrival with Eric Heiser and moderator Brad Riddell at 3:45, and visit Discord, the channel, to chat with other participants during the break. But Liz and Brian, thanks so much. It was a terrific conversation. I had a great time talking with you, and I'm sure everybody just loved it.
Thank you so much. We had a great time. We'll be back.
Yeah,
we'll do it again.